What was it like to live in the Wild West? By 1865, over 30,000 miles of train tracks crisscrossed the United States. With the Civil War over, and many people unshackled from slavery, millions of Americans explored the West, looking to find a new home and riches. The idea of manifest destiny emboldened others. One 19th-century historian famously described the new frontier as the meeting point between savagery and civilization. It wasn't an exaggeration. Scores of buffalo were killed for their hides and to starve Native Americans. New towns popped up along cattle routes, and ruthless cowboys terrorized some, so they had to form their own rule of law. This era was unlike any other time in American history. In today's video, we bring to you incredible facts about the Wild West. Stay tuned as we show you 15 unbelievable facts about the Old West. 15. Failed bandit Elmer McCurdy's corpse had a more interesting life than the man did. In 1911, Elmer McCurdy mistakenly robbed a passenger train he thought contained thousands of dollars. The disappointed outlaw made off with just $46 and was shot by lawmen shortly after that. McCurdy's unclaimed corpse was then embalmed with an arsenic preparation, sold by the undertaker to a traveling carnival, and exhibited as a sideshow curiosity. For about 60 years, McCurdy's body was bought and sold by various haunted houses and wax museums for use as a prop or attraction. His corpse finally wound up in a Long Beach, California amusement park fund. During filming there in 1976, for the television show, the $6 Million Man, the prop's finger, or arm, depending on the account, broke off, revealing human tissue. Subsequent testing by the Los Angeles coroner's office revealed the prop was actually McCurdy. He was buried at the famous Boot Hill Cemetery in Dodge City, Kansas, 66 years after his death. 14. Feral camels once roamed the plains of Texas, one of the wackier ideas in American history. The U.S. Camel Corps was established in 1856 at Camp Verde, Texas. Because the arid Southwest was a lot like the deserts of Egypt, the Army imported 66 camels from the Middle East. Despite the animals' more objectionable qualities, they spat, regurgitated, and defied orders. The experiment was generally deemed a success. As the Civil War broke out, exploration of the frontier was curtailed, and Confederates captured Camp Verde. After the war, most of the camels were sold, some to Ringling Brothers Circus, and others escaped into the wild. The last reported sighting of a feral camel came out of Texas in 1941. Presumably, no lingering descendants of the Camel Corps' members remain alive today. 13. Billy the Kid wasn't left-handed. A famous tintype photograph of Billy the Kid shows him with a gun belt on his left side. For years, the portrait fueled assumptions that the outlaw, born William Bonney, was left-handed. However, most tintype cameras produced a negative image that appeared positive once it was developed, meaning the end result was the reverse of reality. There's another reason we know the picture was a mirror image, and that Billy the Kid was thus a righty. He poses with his Winchester Model 1873 lever-action rifle. The weapon appears to feature a loading gate on the left side, but Winchester only made 1873s that load on the right. 12. The California Gold Rush of 1849 wasn't America's first gold rush. It wasn't even the second. 50 years before some gold nuggets at Sutter's California mill triggered the largest mass migration in U.S. history, a 17-pound chunk of the precious metal was discovered in Cabarrus County, North Carolina, leading to a flood of more than 30,000 prospectors and the Tar Heel State's 30-year reign as the champions of American gold. The initial discovery by 12-year-old North Carolinian Conrad Reed is indeed the first authenticated discovery of gold in the United States, sparking the first American gold rush. The great state of Georgia holds claim to America's second gold rush, though nobody really knows who discovered the shiny metal there first. There are some anecdotal reports of various individuals stumbling upon the magnificent ore. Still, it wasn't until the Georgia Journal printed the following notice that the discovery of gold in the state went on record. Only a few months later, northern Georgia was overrun by those hopeful of striking it rich, despite the protests of the Cherokee Nation, causing the second gold rush in American history to go down in history as the Great Intrusion. California would have its turn, but it had to wait patiently for its Appalachian cousins to run their course. The West may be the best, but everything happens in the East first, at least to the tune of a few hours. The famed gunfight at the OK Corral wasn't much of a shootout, and didn't take place at the OK Corral. One of the most famous gunfights in history, the shootout between the three Earp brothers, Morgan, Virgil, and Wyatt, Doc Holliday, Billy Claiborne, the two Clanton brothers, Billy and Ike, and the two McClory brothers, Frank and Tom, didn't amount to much. Despite the involvement of 8 people, the gunfight only lasted about 30 seconds. Furthermore, the shootout didn't take place within the OK Corral at all. Instead, all the shooting occurred near the current intersection of 3rd Street and Fremont Street in Tombstone, Arizona, which is behind the corral itself. The bloodshed made up for the brevity, though. 3 of the lawmen were injured, and 3 of the cowboys were killed. 10 prostitutes lived the life back in the day. Women had no real rights. Women were barely allowed to work, and those jobs they were permitted to do paid obscenely low salaries. Wives had no legal right to property, and were themselves the lawful property of their husbands. Respectable women in the Wild West could not, to paraphrase Russell, own property, make high wages, have sex outside of marriage, perform or receive oral sex, use birth control, consort with men of other races, dance, drink, walk alone in public or wear makeup, perfume, or stylish clothes. All things women are obviously allowed to do in today's American society. The only women who could do all these things, surprisingly, were prostitutes. As described in Russell's book, madams owned some of the sweetest real estate in the Wild West, during a period in history when women owning land was virtually unheard of. Prostitutes also had the highest income of all American women, and with money comes power, so wealthy madams held great influence in the development of the West. In a time when health insurance wasn't commonplace, some madams even offered free health care to their employees, in addition to private and police protection from rowdy or dangerous clients. In terms of personal freedom, prostitutes were free from the slavery of marriage and were in many ways some of the first true American feminists. Some prostitutes even carried guns, so you best mind your manners. Number 9. One Civil War battle was fought in New Mexico. In a bold move designed to fill rebel coffers with Cripple Creek gold, Confederate General Henry Hopkins Sibley invaded New Mexico Territory from the south in early 1862, believing he could march right up the Rio Grande and take Colorado, unbeknownst to Sibley. However, the 1st Regiment of Volunteers in Colorado caught wind of the scheme and marched 400 miles south in just 13 days to join the Yankees at Fort Union, near Santa Fe. Instead of a cakewalk, Sibley's forces wound up fighting what many historians call the Gettysburg of the West. After just 2 days of skirmishing, Union troops, probably relying on local ranchers as guides, outflanked the Confederates and burned their supply train. After that, it was a long, slow march back to Texas for the rebels, who never returned. Number 8. Banks were quite safe. According to nearly every Western ever made, the Wild West was just that wild. Bandits rode squad deep through ramshackle towns, dragging people behind their horses. Bank robberies were about as common as hitting up the local ATM. People were getting shot in saloons on a nightly basis. Lawlessness just came with the territory. But While this image is good for moving pictures, it ain't so good in terms of historical accuracy. Let's start with bank robberies. According to popular belief, it would seem safer to just keep your money buried somewhere under a cactus than in a bank. In reality, banks were very safe spaces to keep your valuables, perhaps even safer than banks today. According to Larry Schweikart at the Foundation for Economic Freedom, there were only 8 confirmed bank robberies total from 1859 to 1959. As Schweikart points out, there are more bank robberies in modern-day Dayton, Ohio, in a year than there were in the entire Old West in a decade, perhaps in the entire frontier period. Remind us never to store our money in Dayton. The Wild West wasn't even that wild. The law was highly abided in the untamed lands. According to the Mises Institute, property rights were protected and civil order prevailed, thanks to private agencies that provided the necessary basis for an orderly society in which property was protected and conflicts were resolved, such as organized land clubs, cattlemen's associations, mining camps, and wagon trains. Historian W. Eugene Holland claims the West was a far more civilized, more peaceful, and safer place than American society today, as violence was not so culturally ingrained as popular history leads us to believe. In fact, if we really wish to speak of violence in the Old West, we must speak about its real source, the federal government's policies against the Plains Indians. All things considered, you were probably better off storing your money with Alma Garrett and residing in Deadwood than walking the streets of modern-day Chicago. 7. Swinging saloon doors were real, and not a Hollywood invention. In every saloon scene in every Western movie ever made, you'll see the iconic swinging saloon doors. That's how bad guys get thrown into the street. It might be easy to think of this as a Hollywood invention, but these batwing-style doors were actually in popular use during the Old West. With no air conditioning or ventilation, the saloons got hot and smoky really quick. Batwing-style doors offered a little, tiny bit of privacy while letting plenty of fresh air in and stale, smoky, body odor, stench-filled air out. They were also open enough to let music and laughter drift out the door. Saloon owners hoped the sounds of merriment would entice passers-by to stop it. Because parts of the West had a high crime rate, saloons were equipped with a double-door system, swinging doors during operating hours, and solid floor-to-ceiling doors with stout locks to keep the whiskey safe when the saloon was closed. 6. Jesse James' body required 2 graves. Few outlaws were as notorious during their lifetimes as Jesse James. Though he lived a quiet existence in Kearney, Missouri, after his bank-robbing days were over, old friends and enemies never forgot him. After Jesse was murdered, he was buried in the front yard of his farm to thwart grave robbers. As the years passed and his enemies died off, he was reinterred in a Kearney cemetery by his family. So who's that lying in the Jesse James grave in Granbury, Texas? A man named J. Frank Dalton came forward around 1948 at age 101, claiming he was the real Jesse James. A court even allowed him to adopt the bandit's name legally. No one knows why Dalton made this claim or if he ever had any link to Jesse James. Regardless, mitochondrial DNA showed decades later that James is indeed buried in Mount Olivet Cemetery in Kearney. But his legend also lives on in Granbury. 5. Requirements for sheriffs were pretty loose in the Old West. As it is today, sheriff was an elected position and not a particularly appealing one. The pay was paltry if there was one at all. Sometimes a sheriff only receives a percentage of the fines he imposes on people or taxes collected from locals. Does anyone else think a system like this is just inviting corruption? Each state or territory had its own requirements for sheriffs, and none of them involved experience, education, or background checks. Most places only required that a man be 21 years old or older and a U.S. citizen. Some states had no requirements at all. Take Texas, for example. The 1876 Texas Constitution only noted that sheriffs were to serve 2-year terms. Nothing at all was mentioned about age, citizenship, gender, race, or previous criminal record. That's how Moses Burton, an African American, was elected sheriff of Fort Bend County in 1869, a year before the 15th Amendment granted African Americans the right to vote. Burton was the country's first black sheriff. Number 4. The Army declared war on Buffalo. The United States Army declared war on Buffalo in the 1830s. It commissioned people to go west and slaughter as many buffalo as they could and encouraged settlers to do the same. What did the buffalo do to bring the wrath of Uncle Sam down on them? Nothing, except for being a delicious major food source for Native Americans. White Americans, in a total jerk move, wanted to oust the Native Americans from their ancestral homes and take the land for themselves. Since the Native Americans weren't exactly on board with this plan, the government decided to go after their most valuable resource, buffalo. It's been estimated that there were between 10 and 30 million buffalo in the early 18,000s. By 1889, only 256 buffalo remained, and they were in captivity. Number 3. Breakfast on the trail was grueling work. Speaking of, breakfast on the road meant something entirely different for westward pioneers than for people today. It certainly wasn't Starbucks and a bagel. Traveling in a wagon train required waking up at about 4 o'clock in the morning to prepare breakfast, break camp, saddle up the horses, and round up the cattle. Coffee and bacon were staples. The women folk stirred up the fire so they could roast green coffee beans in a skillet. The roasted beans were put through a coffee grinder and then brewed with water over an open fire. Slabs of bacon were tossed in the skillet and fried up. On a good day, you might also get some cornmeal gruel. Bacon wasn't just morning candy. It was such a mainstay that pioneers ate it 2 or 3 times a day. Well, smoked and cured bacon could, in theory, last the whole journey. Number 2. The West was ripe with price gouging. When gold was discovered in California, it set off a massive migration of people who headed to the West, hoping to get rich quickly. They soon realized that the only ones who were really getting rich during the gold rush were the price-gouging merchants who took advantage of the situation and the lack of government oversight. The cost of items sold at the gold rush camps was mind-bogglingly high and made the current inflation problem seem trivial. A dozen eggs, for example, cost about $3 in 1851. When compared to a dozen eggs today, that carton of eggs would cost $105. Merchants also charged $20 for a pound of butter, which is more than $700 today. Number 1. There were strict gun laws. Yes, everyone in the Wild West, and we mean everyone, had a 6-shooter at their hip. Surely that's one fact that can't be false, right? According to every Western we've ever seen, your average town had more guns than a well-stocked Walmart in Tennessee. Well, that's false. Would you believe that the West had potentially stricter gun laws than many states today? In the words of author Robert R. Dijkstra, the uniquely savage and homicide-ravaged Old West is a construct as phony as America's favorite invented tradition. The quick-draw street duel reenacted every day in a score of tourist venues. In reality, property owners and ranchers all over called for tight restrictions on firearms, with the knowledge that more guns in the wrong hands meant more problems. Loads of Western towns did take action, the most famous being Dodge City, Kansas, which proudly displayed a massive sign in the middle of town reading, "The carrying of firearms strictly prohibited." Wichita, Kansas, greeted visitors in 1873 with a sign declaring, "Leave your revolvers at police headquarters and get a check." In fact, according to Adam Winkler, frontier towns, places like Tombstone, Deadwood, and Dodge had the most restrictive gun control laws in the nation, laws that would make some Second Amendment advocates in today's America weak. In many places, even sharpshooting cowboys weren't even allowed to carry guns, as they were told that carrying around a 6-shooter was not a necessary part of their jobs. With Kansas newspaper, the Caldwell commercial, calling revolvers a relic of barbarism. When it comes to guns, today's America is the real Wild West, with the FBI reporting 8,124 gunshot deaths in 2014. And with that, we wrap up today's episode. Thank you for joining us once again. We hope you enjoyed this video. Remember to hit the subscribe button and turn on the notification bell so you will be the first to see our new updates. See you in our next video.